I don't think that everybody necessarily suffers from imposter syndrome. My wife will tell you that she doesn't, and I can confirm. But there's also, there are these common, what Shirzad calls saboteurs. Things like, the overachiever, or the sort of restless, the restless CEO, somebody who's moving from project to project. And these are skills and abilities that potentially got you where you are today. So it's hard to look at those things and see them as potentially holding you back. But there are ways that all of these, and he's got the 9 names for these saboteurs, there are ways that these eventually hold us all back. There might be a skill or ability that got you to a certain place, and then to move on from that place, you have to address maybe the dark side of those skills and abilities. I think one of the big challenges for anybody, but certainly somebody in a leadership position, is being willing to do that learning. Is to be willing to actually look at that. I've had, lots of conversations with people that, and you probably have too, where you have that conversation, you ask them to do some of that inner work, and they kind of, they have defenses, they have reasons, they have excuses. No, it has to be this way. No, I'm fine. I just want more money. I just want my team bigger, whatever it is. And for me, just to be perfectly honest, that's not a thrilling conversation with me. When someone's willing to look a little bit deeper and start to look at things like identity, vision, and purpose, and build that next step where they can have a bigger impact in the world, that's exciting to me.
Welcome to Grow Think Tank. This is the one and only place where you will get insight from the founders and the CEOs of the fastest growing privately held companies. I am the host. My name is Gene Hammett. I help leaders and their teams navigate the defining moments of their growth. Are you ready to grow?
Today we're going to talk about the inner work. Now, you may not want to do the inner work because it's not fun, it's not comfortable, but I do find joy in it now that I've gone so many times, crossed that chasm of the uncomfortableness and facing shame and fear and all that stuff. So this episode, Leaders Do the Inner Work. Our special guest today is Marc Scheff. Marc is a coach, and he works with a lot of creatives and other entrepreneurial leaders. And we just kind of chat about what is sabotaging people that are on this journey of growth, and what is doing the inner work look like, and what are the core elements of it. So leaders do the inner work is our message today. Now, when you think about your expansion, your ability to handle more work, your ability to lead more powerfully, it's not necessarily in the doing, it's in the being. So who are you being? Well, if you're not quite sure how to answer that question, then you probably can't answer the question who you're becoming as you lead this team to the next level or through this next phase. And if you can't put words to that, I think you're missing an opportunity. You're missing the ability to really understand whether you're on alignment or out of alignment. And most of us are out of alignment by default. So if you're curious about the work that I'm doing here and what we're talking, make sure you reach out to me. Gene@genehammett.com is my email. Or if you just want to go and check out my website and the content we have, or schedule a call with me, go to genehammett.com and schedule your call today. Now, here's the interview with Marc. Marc, how are you?
I'm well, Gene. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Well, excited to have a conversation with you. We're both quote coaches in different domains, and we're going to have a great conversation about sort of the inner struggles of leadership and when you're really working with people. Before we jump into that, Marc, give us a little bit of an understanding of who you are and what you do.
Sure. Right now, my focus is on the coaching work that I do. I work with creative leaders and entrepreneurs. My background is long and varied. As I mentioned just before the call, I earned my computer science degree at Harvard and went on to do software development work and leading teams on sort of the front end of the web almost 25 years ago now, and switched over to an art career and building my art skills. But I also built a gallery, a web-based gallery that I continue to run to this day, helping hundreds of artists now sell their work on the web. We are kind of an invite-only gallery, so that's we keep that number relatively small. But I'm really excited now to be doing this work as a coach, where I can blend all of that creative background that I have and the various leadership positions. Without getting into too many details, I've been the executive director of a nonprofit doing artist retreats. I've been the creative director at startups. But the thing that really lights me up is working with people in creative ways to unlock their potential. A lot of folks will get to a place where they're stuck, or maybe things are even going really, really well, and have a hard time seeing past what it is that they're already doing.
Well, that's a great start because it gives us a platform to stand on. Mark, I love the coaching world. There's no question that it's made an impact in my life
Yeah.
outside of it's my business. It's one reason why I am a coach. So I'm just curious, why did you become a coach? Because you've got this varied background. You probably could have chosen different paths, but why coaching?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm very fortunate to have, the support and resources that I have in my life to, basically, choose what it is that I want to do. And that's actually how I got to coaching. When I left, as I mentioned, the organization doing the artist retreats, I didn't have anything specific lined up. And I took that time, and again, glad to have those resources. But I took that time to sit and essentially do something that that we do in coaching was whatever, I don't know what you call the exercise, but you basically take it and put it all on the table. What is it? What are all the things that I've done? And to really make a list of those things, and to look at those things and say, okay, which of those things really lit me up? Which of those things really, to borrow Marie Kondo's term, which of those things spark joy? And put those things back on their own list and say, okay, well, what does that look like? And what it looked like was a lot like these things where I've been the head of the gallery, or I taught art at a school for about 10, 12 years. And when I was working with people and I saw the impact it had on them, and I saw their careers take off, and I saw them impacting other people and growing, that was a feeling of just of pure joy. And so when I looked at that, I said, okay, well, it seems like I want to do something in that realm. I've been in the coaching world for, as I mentioned before, about 20 years, and hadn't ever really put myself out there or put out a platform for it. And so I started to look into it, and that's when I really got into it and started developing my platform.
Well, since you've worked with a lot of people and I've worked with a lot of people, we're just kind of an interesting conversation around some common struggles. And then how do we get people to address those struggles? So let's just go ahead and start off. What are the common struggles you're seeing in the work that you do?
Sure. Good question. There's a researcher who I like quite a bit. His name is Shirzad Chamine, and he does a lot of work on something he calls positive intelligence. And he's been in this game longer than I have, and he's worked with thousands of CEOs and leaders of organizations. And he's developed sort of a system of what these common struggles are, which I like quite a bit. I don't think that everybody necessarily suffers from imposter syndrome. My wife will tell you that she doesn't, and I can confirm. But there's also, there are these common, what Shirzad calls saboteurs. Things like, the overachiever, or the sort of restless, the restless CEO, somebody's, who's moving from project to project. And these are skills and abilities that potentially got you where you are today. So it's hard to look at those things and see them as potentially holding you back. But there are ways that all of these, and he's got the 9 names for these saboteurs, there are ways that these eventually hold us all back. There might be a skill or ability that got you to a certain place, and then to move on from that place, you have to address maybe the dark side of those skills and abilities. I think one of the big challenges for anybody, but certainly somebody in a leadership position, is being willing to do that learning, is to be willing to actually look at that. I've had, lots of conversations with people that, and you probably have too, where you have that conversation, you ask them to do some of that inner work, and they kind of, they have defenses, they have reasons, they have excuses. No, it has to be this way. No, I'm fine. I just want more money. I just want my team bigger, whatever it is. And for me, just to be perfectly honest, that's not a thrilling conversation with me. When someone's willing to look a little bit deeper and start to look at things like identity, vision, and purpose, and build that next step where they can have a bigger impact in the world, that's exciting to me.
Well, I definitely want to go into the inner work, but I also am curious. Being a coach, I see this quite a bit, right? People, what made you successful is it what gets in the way for that next level, and it could be from founder to CEO. You've probably had this conversation before. All jumping in and solving problems and being the problem solver is great when you're a founder, but as you grow a team, it begins to micromanage them. It begins to get in the way of them. When you're, in your journey as an artist, were there similar things that you had to kind of face in that inner work, how you were sabotaging yourself to be able to grow as an artist?
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you're if when you're young, Picasso says everyone's an artist, right? Every kid's an artist. The problem is how to stay one when you grow up, and to stay one when you grow up, you have to make art your business. And this is probably the biggest stumbling block for most creatives, is now finding a way to, even when they just get started, to start charging money for their work. Or certainly if you're running a big agency, that's a little bit less of an issue. But one of the stumbling blocks is that, when we are creating, and I'll say more on that in a minute, but when we are creating, sometimes it's hard to attach, to figure out what that value is. And as a coach, one of the things that you, and probably you and definitely I do, is to work with people to look at what that impact is on other people, to really get that value. And this is kind of a mistake sometimes in different contexts, but in this context, looking at how that impacts other people is one way of kind of taking your own ego out of the conversation. It's like I was working, sometimes when I'm writing stuff, it's hard to sort of it feels like bragging, right? When you're saying, oh, I'm so great, I've done all these things. It's much easier to say, well, look, I had this client who who was, an advisor to Joe Biden. And she, when we were working together, she did X, Y, and Z, built these organizations, formed these partnerships, left these partnerships. These are things that happened that are just facts. And I don't have, and they have value, and I don't have to make that up. And I can feel it if I'm willing to start to look at those things.
Now, Marc's been talking about sabotage. And I think one of the things that he didn't mention there is your blind spots. Now, when I say get to know your blind spots, I don't think that this is an easy thing to do, because you can't do it by reading a book. You don't do it by watching a video or even going to a workshop or having a chat with a friend. You need to work with someone that understands humans, understands how we think and how we work, especially leaders at this level. If you're the CEO of a growing company and you don't know what your blind spots are on a regular basis, you're not getting to know them, you're not doing the work, then you're missing an opportunity. Because I can tell you, my life has completely changed because I was willing to do the work with my wife on my blind spots in my marriage. I use this as to describe some things that are going on inside my business coaching and leadership coaching I do. But I will say to you over and over again, leaders do the inner work. It means get to know your blind spots, get to know where you sabotage, get to know where you're holding yourself back. That is the key to continuous growth. Back to Marc. So now let's go into this inner work.
Sure.
I find that when I first started coaching more than a decade ago, I wasn't prepared for this work. I was prepared for strategy. I was prepared for accountability and did you get the project done and all that stuff. I had no concept of the inner game of leadership and even the inner game of success, period. When you think about this, you threw out identity, vision, and purpose. How does identity play a role in the work of you doing this inner work with your clients?
It's a good question. Well, it leads back to one of the exercises I do. But if you're looking to make a change, or you're looking to take your company to the next level, it's not always obvious what that is. It's easy to, like, as you said, it's easy to create strategies. It's easy to create, revenue. Sometimes it's harder to create that next level for what it is that the vision of the company is. And I think James Clear, in his book Atomic Habits, which I absolutely love, it's a fantastic book. He talks about this when he talks about identity-based habits, and I like his framing of it, because it goes something like, if you are trying to become something, if you're trying to become X, you have to get connected, and you do this through the work of coaching. You have to get connected to a vision, and sometimes we'll actually sit down and we'll close our eyes and we'll talk about it. We'll play it through. I'll have my clients write a page or two about what the world looks like when they've achieved that next level. Now the question around identity is, who is that person being? Who is that person being that's able to do that past where you are now? Another way of looking at it is really from kind of an end of life perspective. When you look, if we went to your end of life and were to look back, what it is that you would like to say, what is the impact that you would like to say that you've had? Now, from that position, tell me about this person. Tell me about this person who's done all that. And if you can do that, and then basically create that mindset in the present, that is where you're going, you can live that right now.
Yeah, we have some overlap in the work we do for sure. I do a lot of work in being, and I actually frame this as the most impactful work I do is deciding, well, not deciding, but putting into words who you're being that's getting in the way of what you want and who do you need to become. Right. So the exercise you just walked through is a different way to get to it. But that's the overlap in our work. And I'm finding that there's a lot of people that don't know how to describe, even though we understand language, but we don't talk about ourselves in this way. Right. Is there a specific struggle that you see commonplace in the inner work with identity with your clients?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard.
Yeah.
Right. It's hard to look at yourself. And if depending on your personality type and, depending on which of Shirzad's saboteurs you have, it can be really hard to show that vulnerability. It can feel like weakness. It can feel like kind of cracks in the facade, and it can feel like something you're kind of not supposed to show. I think there's a balance. Leadership. You need to trust leadership. Showing, if you're really feeling very, very worried, say, about the future of your company, you maybe don't want to communicate that. That's not, you're not going to trust that. But being honest about what problems you're facing, or even if you're not facing problems and you have a place you want to go, going there with your managers, your VPs, that's, I think, an important conversation. But I think that back to, to your question, I think the real challenge there is that it can feel very vulnerable to go into that work, which is why I think it's important to do that work. If someone's willing to, go there with you, to do that work, with someone like a coach who can be that safe space to say whatever's true, and then you can develop the strategy. Okay, so how, what from what we've learned here about who you're becoming, how do we then create success from that in your company?
Now, he was talking about feeling vulnerable. I think vulnerability is a lot of things. A lot of people avoid that because they think in leadership, I'm not going to get too personal. They draw these boundaries. Now, I will just go ahead and say this. You can be too vulnerable. You can lay out things that are not necessarily inside of the relationships you have. They're not ready for it. The trust isn't there. The real kind of connection that you need. You can be too vulnerable. But the problem is most people err on the side of not being vulnerable enough. They think that whatever they're sharing that shouldn't play a role inside of our business relationships. And I will disagree with that. You want to make sure that you're courageous enough to talk about the things that have gotten in your way. Maybe there's stories that you share with your team about the things that you learned the hard way, the things that cause you to face your fears, the things that you had to overcome. All are helpful in the journey of their growth. Now, you need to do this well. You need to have your stories written in such a way or described in such a way that they actually do allow the person to process. I think that this is really important because it really helps people grow to that next level when they can use vulnerability the right way. Back to Marc. So let's move on to the other aspects you mentioned there beyond identity, which was vision. This comes up in my work quite often. How does it show up in your work?
Well, without knowing how it shows up in your work, I don't imagine it's terribly different. I think there's lots of science that shows the value of vision, and this actually connects to the previous conversation, because there's a few ways that you can go about this with a client. For some clients, it's very easy to say, okay, let's go to end of life. Let's go 3 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out. Tell me about where you are. Tell me about what's going on. That kind of associating in to a vision, really stepping in and being there, is accessible for some people, not for everybody. For some, you have to sort of dissociate. So you might imagine looking at somebody else, looking at yourself in the future as a different person and describing what's happening to them. And sometimes it's a little bit easier to actually go and describe something as if it's happening to somebody else, and then do some work to try to connect to that. But with visioning, there's some really incredible science around it. One of the studies that I read was about a basketball team, and they had half the players sort of practice 3 throws and half the players just imagine, I forget what the exact setup was, but they had them visualize hitting them. And then, predictably, when they had them actually go and do it, the folks who were practicing did no better, or maybe even a little bit worse than the folks who just sat and kind of visualized themselves, the feel of the ball moving through those motions. So the power of visualization is, and this gets to some brain science too, it's like when you imagine yourself doing something, it's pretty close in many ways, even physically, to your body doing it. Josh Waitzkin, who was the subject of the movie Finding Bobby Fischer, he wrote a book called The Art of Learning, talking about this happening to him in his life, where he got into martial arts and had a very serious injury where he couldn't use one of his arms. But he had a tournament coming up and he wasn't going to have time to train. But while he was in the hospital, he would exercise this functional arm and visualize his other arm moving along. And when they, this is in his book, so it's secondhand, but he says that when the doctors took the cast off, they were amazed because the arm hadn't atrophied. So there's lots of science and anecdotal evidence to this. But when you're working with somebody on a vision, we look at not just like, oh, I've got tons of money and cars and freedom and all that stuff. That's important. But then what else is there? Tell me about your environment. Who else is there? Who else is impacted by this vision? Who benefit really from this vision? People often go to their families, and that's great. But if you're working at that high level, let's talk about your customers, your audience. What is the benefit that they get from you being, from you becoming this identity that we talked about?
Now, one more quick moment. Marc's been talking about vision and the basketball. That study comes from University of Chicago. I've used this and read about this quite a bit, talked about it in my coaching as well. Told you there's some overlap here, but it is a real interesting study where they had 3 different groups, which is those that actually got to shot baskets every day. They have those that visualized and those that did nothing. And between the 30 days, as I remember, between that, they measured the very first day and the last day of this study, and they measured the differences. And those that actually did the baskets and practiced every day actually did perform better. But statistically, it was not different from those that were doing it just in their mind. The visual aspects of shooting was almost the same level of performance as those that had done it. Now, the control group, meaning the ones that didn't, all they did was the first and the last day, they performed the worst. They didn't grow inside of that study. But I just wanted to share with you some of the details of this University of Chicago study. All right, back to Marc. Marc, we're going to wind this down, but I don't want to leave the audience hanging. We talked about the inner work, starting with identity, vision, then you mentioned purpose.
Did.
What about purpose allows us to really get to the real heart of the inner work that's necessary for us to grow as leaders and even be successful in other domains of life?
I think purpose is really, in many ways, the key to this growth, because it's beyond your current situation and it touches every area of your life. When I think about it and when I work with people on it, it's not just my purpose at my job or my purpose at home with my kids or my purpose with my partner or friends, but it's something that it really encapsulates both the identity and the vision, and it's about that impact. It's about, well, the way that we talk about it, or the way that I talk about it, is it's about the gift that you're giving to the world and who gets that gift, and then what the world looks like after that. So it encapsulates a little bit of all of these things.
Fantastic. One last question, Marc. What is it we haven't touched on that you feel like needs to be said as it relates to leaders finding their sabotage and doing the inner work to be able to grow to the level at which they really want?
That's another great question. What haven't we touched on? Well, I think we kind of danced around it a little bit, but I think, in the work that I do, and just in my life and being in the world, we all have areas for growth. I think everyone has some area where they're looking to grow, whether it's personally or professionally. I think those areas often overlap, and I think the best leaders are the ones who understand that is kind of a fundamental human need in a way, and are willing to do that work of learning and create that culture of learning within their organizations by leading by example, by taking on either a coach or some other support for their own learning, and also supporting that within their organizations. Like I said, I don't know if I said before or after we got on the call, but I don't work with absolutely everybody. I work with the people who understand that we are here to continue to learn, to continue to grow. And when we work together, you have to be willing to do that inner work. And that's why I love coaching, because it creates that safe space. It's a confidential space. You can come in and say, whatever kinds of terrible things you think, and we can work with it and try to figure out what's underneath and where to go from there.
Very well said, Marc. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a real pleasure.
Wow. I love talking to other coaches about the work that we're doing that overlaps. And I know there's work that we do that's different, but today we talked about what's sabotaging you. We didn't get into some of the elements like the blind spots or the things that we're just, unaware of and how to address and put into words. But great conversation. Leaders do the inner work was the topic today. And if you're looking for someone to help you do the inner work, make sure to reach out to Gene. Schedule a call with me. It's genehammett.com. And as always, when you think of growth and you think of leadership, think of Growth Think Tank and lead with courage.